Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. My name is Rebecca Power. I am joining you from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I will be your moderator. Since some of you may be new to the North Central Region Water Network, I know some of you are not, but we let folks know every time that we are an extension-led collaboration among 12 universities and our partners in 12 upper Midwestern states. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is a topic I am excited to be moderating, excited to be presenting, and excited for our presenters. We're going to be talking a little bit about equity and green infrastructure and have just some excellent presenters and an excellent report to preview for you, and look forward to your participation in the conversation. To participate in the conversation, you can submit your questions for presenters in the chat box. And as part of Blackboard Collaborate here, the chat box is in the lower, you can find it in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. And there's a little chat balloon there that you can click on. You should be able to use that. There will be, we'll hold questions until each of our three presenters is done, and we will have a Q&A session after they're done. And we try to leave plenty of time for questions. If you're having any audio issues, phone-in option can be accessed by opening what we call the session menu. It's a little hamburger menu in your the upper left-hand area of your screen, and you can select use your phone for audio. We do record these sessions and make them available on our website, northcentralwater.org. You can also find them at learn.extension.org. And for the best user results, if you're having any technical glitches, try switching to Chrome, Google Chrome if you're not already there. And we will be doing some live tweeting here, so you can contribute via social media as well. Okay, so today's presenters, Carla Walker, founder and CEO of Think Big Strategies. Tony Heath is now at Fishbeck Incorporated, was working for the University of Illinois. He is a civil and environmental engineer and urban planner. And Yordanos Solomon, Director of Equitable Engagement. What a great title, at Metro Blooms. And there's the instructions for following the conversation live on Twitter. So before I get to Carla, I just want to read, if I'm not stealing any thunder here, the first short paragraph from the report that we're going to hear a little bit more about in this presentation, and just because I think it summarizes so well some of the issues and some of the reasons that this team and the North Central Region Water Network engaged in this project. So the beginning of the report says, climate change will bring more intense storms, drought, heat waves, and other severe weather events. Histories of subjugation and institutional racism in the United States mean that communities most exposed to these events are those that are already facing inequities. Low-income communities in both urban and rural areas are on the front line of climate change. To rise to these challenges, we can, quote, not continue to plan for it using the tools of the past. And we know everybody is being impacted by climate change, and there's plenty of challenges to go around, but we want to highlight and focus on some of the particular issues that urban areas and people of color are facing. And with that, I would love to introduce Carla Walker, have the privilege to introduce Carla. And you can see from her bio, I never read these in entirety, but I want to share one of the reasons for these speed networking webinar series is to introduce you to some of the amazing leaders we have in the North Central region around water, in addition to some of the work that they're doing. So Carla is one of those amazing leaders. She's advised elected officials, nonprofits, business leaders, has a long history of great work. And you can read a little bit more about her there. And now we have the privilege from Carla. So welcome.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Great. All right. So I'm excited to be joining you for this session of the current. We're doing doing this work during some challenging times. It's incredibly sad that there have been some deplorable current events that have resulted in a hyper focus on equity and racial equity in particular. And so, as that relates to climate change and sustainability, I really just want to acknowledge two realities before we get started. One, this is not new. EJ, environmental racism, climate justice, these concepts have been around for a while. And while we are at this point because there's a broader public acknowledgement that there are causes and effects of some of the foundations of systemic racism have been underpinning some of our societal norms. So having that framing, I just want to dive into a couple of concepts. I'm a big fan of the work of Majora Carter. She's a leading urban revitalization strategist from the South Bronx and has led several urban green infrastructure projects in New York City. I honestly think her career is a case study in equitable green infrastructure. So I encourage you to check out her TED Talk. It's called Greening the Ghetto, for her, just kind of her evolution of her career. But I'm sharing this quote here to kind of help sharpen our focus. She's talking about this idea of smart infrastructure where we can be creative in responding to communities that are experiencing multiple crises, and that it's a balance between infrastructure and social needs. And what we're talking about really is kind of shifting systems, right? Changing systems and changing the status quo. For equity work, you really need to have some sort of shared understanding of terminology. So I'm going to step through a couple of concepts here, but I strongly recommend participating in a formal equity or anti-bias training for a more robust dive into these. So here's this visualization of equality, right? I want to point out two things. One, with an equality lens, you're ensuring that everyone gets the same response, the same assets, the same supports. But two, you've got to know that the outcomes may not be what you are aiming for, because equality ignores the historical and structural factors that benefit some social groups and disadvantages others. Now, when you kind of put equity next to it, you see that equity acknowledges that there are some unequal starting places for people, and the outcomes is to provide some different levels of support to achieve fairness. A caution here is to understand that these terms are not necessarily synonymous. While there is a thin layer of similarity in purpose, they do require different strategies in their applications. And to put a finer point on it, an equitable solution requires acknowledgement of the reality of the situation. And when the work is impacting marginalized or frontline communities, you do have a number of coexisting challenges due to that institutionalized or those historically unfair policies that have created so many barriers to their full participation that may hinder their uptake of the benefits. And so a project that is designed from the outstart to examine and remove these barriers is what I see as the justice leg of this work. And what we are really talking about is acknowledging and reintroducing equity back into the sustainability equation. And here's how Carl Anthony refers to it. Anthony directed the Ford Foundation's Sustainable Metropolitan Communities Initiative, and he also spearheaded a dialogue of national policy analysts and advocates for new metropolitan racial justice strategies. And from the perspective of kind of delivering governmental services in an equitable manner, I kind of down social equity here, where it's the fair, just, and equitable management of all institutions serving the public directly or by contract. And then it's kind of like how that is working its way through the distribution of public services and the development and implementation of policy. So having that quick review of concepts, I'm going to share a few applications, right? So large-scale GI projects can be met with some community resistance and may end up resulting in unintended consequences where, yes, the project is providing this new resource to a historically disadvantaged community, but the green improvements end up fracturing those communities even further and exacerbating racial and socioeconomic injustices. So I want to offer two examples. The first being the phenomena of eco or green gentrification, this idea that the processes started by the implementation of a green initiative leads to that exclusion or the displacement of disenfranchised residents. And you're seeing one example here. I don't know how many folks have been to the High Line in New York, but that construction began on this project in 2006. And since it's opened in 2009, approximately 5 million visitors go to that site each year. Property values have skyrocketed. There's been a surge in development, but what's ended up happening is long-standing residents and businesses, the community that was actually there, those individuals and businesses have had to relocate and move out. So the project has managed to transform the entire socioeconomic character of the neighborhood that surrounds it. And so one way to probably mitigate something like that would have been to maybe think about centering housing affordability within that project. It's an approach known as affordability first, where the provisions to preserve significant housing affordability are put in place before other aspects of the project are considered. And here's another example. Last year, City Lab highlighted a Detroit tree canopy program that took place in the early 2000s, and nearly 25% of the residents of the community of color declined to participate in this program. So what happened, right? It was reported that over the life of the project, the vast majority of volunteers who engaged and interacted with the community were not from Detroit, and the ones who were from Detroit were not necessarily from the community. It was also reported that the outreach strategy was not inclusive. These are two of the main issues that were reported. So residents felt like the decisions that were being made or that had been made about what was going to happen in their neighborhood were done completely without their input, without even so much as asking them. And that led to them intentionally bypassing this natural asset that would have provided shade for their home, helped decrease their energy bills, and beautify their neighborhood. And so the danger here is that future projects or programs for these communities could be influenced by the misinterpretation that this community might not have cared for those kinds of sustainable interventions or climate change mitigation initiatives. And this could have been resolved by altering the approach to the project development, where it is more inclusive and focused on nurturing community relationships and incorporating community needs. I just want to share, though, that the organization that did conduct that project in the early 2000s is still around. It's really now thriving and delivering some great equitable green projects across Detroit. So weaving social equity into climate action plans has only recently been explored by cities. There was a 2015 review of about 28 of the largest U.S. cities that operated with the CAP that found that only a few of them were making social equity goals an important component of those plans. And in 2018, there was a global climate action summit for non-state actors at the regional and local level that really began focusing on identifying opportunities to include equity consideration in CAPs and begin to address the experiences of marginalized citizens and or vulnerable communities disproportionately burdened by climate change. And so we know that cities are the labs for exploring innovative approaches around climate change. So over 400 mayors have crafted local or regional climate action plans as part of their effort to uphold the Paris Climate Agreement. And at the 2017 National League of Cities Conference, more than 100 mayors and council members signed a letter to the president reiterating the role of cities to affect climate change. Now, earlier this year, there was a study that looked at equity in green infrastructure plans from 20 cities around the country. And in that in that report, it was determined that cities, even though they included equity in the plan, it was more of an aspirational goal, but included no mechanisms for assessment or enforcement. But I really think because of what's happening now in the world, things are changing rapidly as city leaders are responding to some of these current crises, right? C40 cities just recently launched their agenda to deliver an equitable and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And that agenda is built around a few key actions critical to achieving the goal of green and just recovery. Action around jobs and inclusive economy, actions around resilience and equity, actions around health and well-being. Climate Mayors has a similar platform where 198 mayors from 41 states have signed on to that platform. An example of a city integrating equity into its GI plans with real results is Milwaukee. Based in part on the historic urban floods of 2010, Milwaukee adopted their green infrastructure plan in 2019. And I just want to kind of highlight a couple of things where I think it's really great in terms of a model, right? One, it's required, there's a requirement that green infrastructure on all large developments captures the first half inch of rainfall, and this roots GI strategies into city policy. It prioritizes training and job opportunities with the policy to create a diverse and equitable green workforce. It also recommits the partnership and collaboration with Milwaukee Public Schools to transform green schoolyards with green schoolyard infrastructure projects. And it prioritizes additional, and I think this is really critical, it prioritizes additional funding for green streets and parking lots. And I think that's important because it helps bake green infrastructure into the city budget. As I close out, I want to offer a quote by Robert Bullard, who I just think the world of. He is known as, the grandfather of environmental justice, but it just puts a finer point on how interrelated this work needs to be to accomplish sustainability using equitable green infrastructure. And I think it actually begins with having some clarity around values, right? Envisioning the kind of community we all want to live in together. So I've given a broad picture of this work, but I'm going to turn it over now to Tony and Nordy, and they can drill down a little further.
Great, thank you, Carla. Thank you for that overview. It helps ground us well in the next conversations. And now, as Carla said, we'll hear from Tony Heath. So Tony Heath is a civil and environmental engineer and urban planner specializing in green infrastructure now in Grand Rapids. And again, you can read a little bit more about Tony there, but we're excited to hear from him about some lessons learned in this equitable green infrastructure project and report that we've been talking about. And these are really lessons learned from talking with communities across the North Central region. So Tony, take it away.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Carla. I love speaking after you because you do such a great job of framing the issue and explaining why this is all so connected and all so important. So like I said, I'm going to dig down more into a little bit of what we did on this specific project and talk about some of the lessons learned about workforce development and equity through green infrastructure as part of a series of community listening sessions that we held in the winter of this year. So first, for those of you who aren't as familiar, what is green infrastructure? Green infrastructure broadly are practices which restore or mimic natural systems. It's generally thought of in terms of hydrology, things like rain gardens, permeable pavements, constructed wetlands, ways to improve water quality and reduce flooding. But it can also include things like solar panels and wind power, anything that harnesses a natural system to meet some of our human infrastructural needs, that's what green infrastructure is. So the need for the study. As cities across the US are turning to green infrastructure as a result of EPA mandates to update their aging systems, it's becoming more and more prevalent. As it becomes more and more widespread, the number of related jobs will continue to grow around it. And green infrastructure has a huge potential to be a tool for social justice, because instead of just managing a stormwater issue from an engineering side, it can also be a tool for improving communities and a tool for social justice. However, despite all of these things, a lack of institutional knowledge and formal guidance have led to very localized approaches. Almost every community that we spoke with was approaching this in different ways. And a lot of the lessons that some of the more experienced communities had learned during their process, there wasn't a great way to pass that knowledge on to the communities that were just starting out. So a brief overview of the listening sessions. Between January of this year and April, we held 18 listening sessions across 9 states in the upper Midwest, representing more than 30 communities. And these listening sessions had 3 themes. First, how are communities using green infrastructure to address equity issues? Second, how are communities using it as a means for workforce development? And third, what other barriers exist for communities that are preventing them from successfully implementing green infrastructure? And what can we do as a network of practitioners to help them address them? So I'm not going to go into this because I know I only have 10 minutes. But basically what we did in this sessions is first we asked people to tell us about their green infrastructure in general, and then we dug down into some of the more specifics of the way they're applying it and the way they're thinking about equity and workforce development. So first, green infrastructure and equity. And after Carla's talk, it's very clear, stormwater management is an equity issue. Who gets city resources and who gets investment by regional planning organizations is not equitably distributed. And very often, the residents in flood-prone areas are often marginalized in other ways. They're in low-lying areas that are flood-prone. They may be on old industrial areas. They're facing other inequities and other injustices. So green infrastructure has this unique potential not only address flooding and water quality issues, but also to be a solve for some of these long-standing social inequities, such as pollution and lack of access to green space. So we found that the communities that were most successful, not just in addressing equity, but in implementing green infrastructure in general, were those communities that adopted a co-benefit mindset. And a quote from Lisa Sasso, who's with the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewer District, and like Carla said, they're at the forefront of this. She said, "We never want to do anything for just one reason. We always look at the triple or quadruple bottom line." And I think that's especially important right now, as we're just beginning to realize the long-term effects of the COVID pandemic and how this is going to hurt city and state budgets. We have a mandate to address stormwater issues, and I think we also have a responsibility to make sure that we're doing as much as possible with those dollars that we do spend. So when you're spending money on those projects, ask what else this project can do for your community to help you get more for your money. And so, however, despite this potential to address some of these bigger issues, a lot of the communities that we spoke with preferred technical approaches because they wanted to avoid the appearance of bias. They didn't want to seem like they were favoring one community over another. But that's equality, like Carla talked about. Technical approaches are not truly neutral. If you're not taking existing inequities into consideration, you'll only continue to preserve the status quo. So it's important to ask, what are you hoping to achieve with this project, and who is going to benefit? What more can we do? A specific example of a city who I think is doing a great job is the city of Peoria in central Illinois. They, in 2013, came under a US EPA mandate to address their combined sewer overflow. And their combined sewer overflow is also in the oldest area of town, which is one of the poorest areas of town. So this area that had a major stormwater issue also was one of the areas that they wanted to invest and uplift the residents. So they saw this as an opportunity to address stormwater management and invest in their community. So since 2013, Peoria has employed this GI-based approach to stormwater management that hasn't just been capital projects and infrastructure investments, but it's also included education for students, education for communities, and also very importantly, job training programs. They want to find a way to bring these underrepresented communities into green infrastructure and use this as a vehicle to promote entrepreneurship and promote wealth building in those communities. I thought a quote that was really powerful from her, from Jane Gertis with Peoria Public Works, is, we're mandated to do it because it's in the CSO, but we're very cognizant of assigning those code benefits so that we improve those areas of disinvestment and poverty. That way we can leverage that mandated stormwater management into a community improvement. The other aspect of the study that we looked at was green infrastructure and workforce development. As green infrastructure becomes more prevalent, the number of jobs will continue to grow, and these will be skilled jobs. There's two forms of workforce development: incidental workforce development, which is just the natural diffusion of skills as practices become more widespread. And there's deliberate workforce development, which is when communities take a programmatic approach to growing the industry. There were three main approaches to deliberate workforce development that we saw communities applying. The first are training and certification programs, like the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. The second is the Pathway to Employment programs. The Peoria Corps and the Green Stewards program are examples of this. This is where you provide pathways to employment for either young people as a pre-apprentice program or for adults experiencing barriers to employment. And the third way are through the use of green infrastructure incubators. And these are programs which reach out and target people in underrepresented communities and try to teach them both the technical, the hard skills, as it were, for installing, designing green infrastructure, but also the soft skills required with running a business, including client management, budget development, project management, and that sort of thing. There's been a lot of challenges with communities who have looked to use workforce development through green infrastructure. These existing programs have had mixed results. They have done a good job of disseminating skills among their workforce, but they've failed to provide pathways to long-term green infrastructure careers. A lot of these programs have been focused on laborer jobs, green infrastructure installation and maintenance, that type of thing. But a lack of demand, seasonality, and low wages make green infrastructure installation an unattractive career path. So we found in the communities that we were speaking with, they wanted to find a way to move away from green infrastructure jobs and focus on green infrastructure careers, which had opportunities for development, advancement, and then community wealth building. In a case brief, one of the communities that we spoke with was actually outside of the North Central region. It was Seattle, Washington, and we talked to them about their RainWise program. And something that they're doing with this, like I mentioned, is the creation of a green infrastructure program, green infrastructure incubator. This program would be aimed at underrepresented communities and have scholarships for people to pay their way through the program. And it would include 0 to 100 training. So it would first teach them the basics of landscaping design, landscape maintenance, the construction skills, the technical skills to physically go out and do the job. But then also it would give them the training and support needed to help them run a business. And this has a lot of potential compared to traditional programs because it addresses some of these challenges. It says it is a way to create a green infrastructure career, not just a green infrastructure job, and create the next generation of mentors within green infrastructure. And it goes out and attempts to reach underserved communities and grow the pool of green infrastructure contractors rather than just training people who would already be within the construction industry, which are typically white men. So wrapping up, before passing on to Yordi, I wanted to share the top 5 lessons learned and best practices from these. The first was to keep it simple. The communities that we spoke with, one of the most enduring lessons that they learned was that the first project they did was way over designed. They tried to do too much all at once. It was beyond their capabilities to maintain and care for. And so these projects grew out of control, and then it was seen as a failure. So keep it simple at first, and then as you develop that capacity, then develop the complexity. The second, emphasize the co-benefit. Ask what more you can get for your money besides just stormwater management. This helps bring in additional partners. This helps bring in additional funding, and this helps open your eyes to new ways that you can promote and invest in your community. Third, focus on green infrastructure careers, not just green infrastructure jobs. Look for full-time work that provides a sustaining wage and has opportunities for advancement. Fourth, the importance of education at every level. There's a lot of programs and efforts out there aimed at homeowners and entry-level designers, but there needs to be more education aimed at children and more education aimed at high-level decision makers within government, explaining what green infrastructure is, why it's valuable, and why it's important. And the fifth is just the importance of building relationships and establishing partnerships. I think Yordi's going to talk about this a lot, the importance of working closely with the community, establishing that trust and establishing those relationships. Because that's truly how you learn what the community values and how you can make a project that is actually serving them rather than just serving your perceived need. And so special thanks to Lisa Merrifield, who was the project manager on this, and the other listening session facilitators, without whom I could not have done this research. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Tony. Yes, and I know at least Lisa is lurking here as one of our participants. So yes, thanks, Lisa and the whole project team for your leadership. And thanks, Tony, for a great presentation. Now we get into a little bit more depth in one case of how one organization and one community has gone about this. So pleased to introduce Yordi Solomon, who is a Minneapolis transplant from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. She is now the Director of Equitable Engagement at Metro Blooms and works on stormwater management and that building relationships component and facilitating engagement of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in water and climate change. So thanks so much, Yordi, and you're on.
Thank you. I hope you're able to hear me. Okay. Thank you for having me. I think that's the first thing I want to say. I'm really excited to be here and listening to everyone. I think it's been really wonderful. I also want to echo what Carla said earlier, which is that this whole conversation is not new. This whole approach is not new. We're just reframing it again and again. I think the previous speakers, both Tony and Carla, did a very good job of framing it for me. So now I will just talk about my organization. Okay. I'm not going to go over because I think the bio says most of it. But I think one thing you need to know about me is that I'm a community organizer with an environmental science background. So that shapes the way that I look at things generally. So you'll probably see that a lot of that as I go forward in the presentation. So I'm going to hopefully talk about my organization, which is called Metro Blooms. I'm going to go over some of the lens that we use in our green infrastructure as it relates to equity, some of the co-benefits as talked about before. I'm not going to talk about all our projects. I'm just going to talk about one specific project that we work with like closely with the community, and then just thinking about revisioning and refining some of these like equitable engagement as we go forward. So before that, my organization is called Metro Blooms. We're a 501c nonprofit organization. And we partner with communities to generally, I think our approach is create resilient landscapes. If you can't have resilient landscapes without resilient communities. And we work with watersheds, we work with institutions, we work with schools, we work with everyone who hires us. We also have an educational program called Blue Thumb, which it coordinates a lot of partnership between contractors, landscapers, but I think they all kind of come under the idea of improving water quality and creating, habitat. And I think these are some of the things that we offer. You can look us up on metroblooms.org. I'm gonna pass. I think there's more information that is much more valuable for everyone here. So before that, I like definitions and context. The way that we define equitable engagement is as this. Equitable engagement is an intentional participation of a community with emphasis on those most impacted or underserved. In this case, it would be renters, people of color, low income, or otherwise marginalized. And most of these identities are obviously could be intersectional and usually are. By green infrastructure projects and those most often underrepresented within environmental improvement projects. And right now we're doing equitable engagement in different stances. We're working in affordable housing community, which is what I'm going to be focusing today on. We work with organizations and associations, like tenant associations specifically, because they have a very close tie with the communities. We work with environmental justice communities. North Minneapolis, even if you don't live in Minnesota, you probably know North Minneapolis is considered an environmental justice community. We also do some consulting partnerships, like how do we actually move toward an equitable engagement work? And some of that thing. But today, again, I'm going to focus on the affordable housing communities because I only have 10 minutes. This will take hours. And I think as for the lens, this is kind of our main lens. We use the equity and empowerment lens. And it kind of boils down to who is impacted in this community that we're working with. How are resources distributed geographically? And then also, I think the process is a big part of it. How are we designing the process itself? So we have a lot of landscape designers that we work with. And are they doing this in an equitable way? Are they making the information accessible? Are they making the information shareable? Are they making the information interactive? And also, I think at the end of the day, what are the obstacles to do this kind of work generally? And I think these are some of the questions that kind of shape our principles in doing work with these communities. I'm gonna go to those communities. I'm giving a lot of sneak peeks. So affordable housing communities, like I said, are typically communities that are kind of left out. And these are the primary communities we work with as an organization. We've been working with them since 2016. This has allowed us to change, refine some of these principles based on, on these communities because they have very unique set of problems than typical home owners, or even these are usually like multifamily housings that have a lot of communities that have not been served in water quality issues in the past. And again, like some of the framings is that, does this project benefit the people that are most impacted, the residents? Are they building agency throughout this? And I think that kind of moves us to are we building community capacity? A community is already there, but are we building capacity? After Metro Blooms leaves, is this project sustainable? Are they able to do other types of projects on their own as a collective? And also affirm that our work does not contribute to displacement or gentrification, mostly known. I think green infrastructure generally is very much hand in hand with gentrification. So a lot of people are really suspicious at the beginning, as they should. So we have to acknowledge that our work does not contribute to displacement. And also, as we are working toward with our community, we acknowledge that we cannot address climate change without addressing racial equity. We have to be explicit in our conversations. We have to be explicit in the way that we equitably compensate the people that we work with in like at all levels. And so it all kind of comes down to engaging and empowering residents. And this is not just like a Metro Bloom's job. Like, we're not doing this by ourselves. We usually work with organizations that are already doing this work, like tenant associations, neighborhood associations. There's also a resident, driven collectivism that already exists there. We try to build stewardship and trust with them before we approach the project in any capacity. So we apply for other grants that are not just specifically, clean water related. So that we can talk about like what does valuable and meaningful involvement and empowerment look like. And some of these pictures are from some of the community events we've had with residents that live in the communities. We also have just resident meetings, like what do you need right now? And we also are very transparent about what we are not able to accomplish, but we can facilitate conversations like management issues, co-creating this like shared vision of like, what does a healthy environment look like to you? And I think that kind of creates like a dialogue between us and the residents. We're not installing anything, we're not putting anything in place yet, we're just having a conversation with them. These pictures are a conversation with some of our landscape designers in, the affordable housing site. I think one on the left is from Bois Claire in Brooklyn Park, which has a large population of West African people. And then on the right, I believe it's Brooks Garden. And we also do a lot of leadership training. Again, this is not just work that's done by Metro Blooms. We work with tenant associations and other organizations that are doing empowerment, like ACER is an organization we've been working with in Brooklyn Park specifically. And we do training focused on equitable engagement. How do you actually think about some of these like door knocking, and how do you actually engage with your neighborhood? So we're not just putting in like green infrastructure, BMP, or anything else like that. That's not the only focus. It goes beyond that. Like, how else are we creating empowerment to this community in different ways within the scope within the scope of what we have. Okay, gonna try one. And then we also have clean water picnics where we, everyone kind of relates around food. So we have food and then we also just have, again, more conversations, and people come and they, we're creating visibility in the community. This is, a larger community, not just the stewards that we work with or the climate captains that we have created relationships with, but whatever whoever is in the community is invited to this, and we just talk about different things, and our landscape designers usually are there, asking what do you think of this project? Did you even notice this happening? Those type of conversations take place at these events. And our design process, I'm not going to go too much into this, is multi-step. So we have a lot of back and forth with the residents. Like, do you like this? And we try to simplify it. Like, if you want, we have a lot of rendering of like what could take place. Like one of the communities that we work with, they really wanted like playground. Obviously, that's not something we're able to do, but we facilitated, a grant that allowed for a playground to be installed there. So, building those trust in different ways, not just like looking at the benefits of like what our organization needs at this moment within the scope of what we have. Yeah, we also have resident plantings, which are essentially parties, and people usually come out to these, and they're a lot of fun. I don't know, there's not a lot to say here. It's just creating that, like, more of that social cohesion in different ways again. And I think a big thing that we do a lot is like we share a lot of our stories with other green organizations, nonprofits, watersheds that are just like, okay, you're a tiny nonprofit. How are you doing this equity work in different ways? And I mean, I'm not saying we don't even do it, close to perfect, but I think this is, if we are able to do it, I think you can do it as a county. I think you can do it as a watershed organization. I think that's the type of sharing that we do. And we ask question, what does a community's meaningful involvement look like in an organization or a community? When we ask those questions, we're kind of letting people, like, we're not like leading or anything, because this is work that has already been done. It's just like we're amplifying it in different ways. And I think I will close with this, which is that we have a lot of guiding principles doing this work intentionally. Like I said, I'm a community organizer. That's my background. But so I'm always thinking about, what does transparency look like? What does accountability look like? So we acknowledge that, again, we cannot address climate work without addressing racial equity, which is really, really tied to economic equity. So when we actually work in these communities, we understand those are really tied. So we can't expect people to come to these events without equitably compensating for their time, having food, just like things that you don't really think about much because you're like, oh, it's going to be in your community. Of course, you should care about this. I feel like there's a lot of assumptions in those types of like interactions, which kind of, again, causes distrust between the community and the people that are coming in to build something. Again, what does transparency look like? Can we address the limitation of the project head on? And I think we try to do that as much as we can. And I think when we mess up, people call us out. We kind of have created that relationship. At this point, we have to reflect on an ongoing basis. And that is all. I kind of try to go fast as possible, but thank you. And that's all.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Yardi, so much. Okay, let's get right into questions. I'll just leave your slide up right there because it's got the questions on it. So Joe asks, and I think this was during Tony's presentation, you mentioned landscaping. Can you give some other specific example of GI jobs and careers?
Sure. So some examples, the city of Buffalo mentioned solar power and wind power as being, other non-hydrology forms of green infrastructure. And something that they're doing in city of Buffalo is integrating, hydrologic green infrastructure training, some of these alternative energy fields as well, so that it counteracts some of the seasonality of green infrastructure work. City of Milwaukee is taking a similar approach. They're diversifying their programs to be more generally about water resources. So during the summer, they may do green infrastructure work, but during the winter, they may work in an office or may work in a water treatment facility or something like that. Other types of careers beyond just contracting, there's working as a laborer versus owning a contracting business. But something we also want to promote is green infrastructure design. And I think this ties into what Yordi was talking about giving, having that conversation with residents and having that conversation with members of this community. You're providing ways for them not just to do the work, but that for them to shape the work and for it to reflect them and empower them and address some of the issues that they may be facing. So, planning and design is one other type of green infrastructure work, but also diversifying into water resources or other types of green infrastructure like alternative energy would be some examples.
Great. Thank you, Tony. And I'm going to ask all of you Suzanne and Tracy's questions together. So Tracy's is the broader one. What kinds of partners can an organization look for to build this kind of program or effort? And specifically, is there a profile or a group of partners that you found have worked well? And then Suzanne's question specifically is financial contributions from some of those partners, particularly community governments.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. Some of the partners that worked really well were going outside of water resources. There's pretty limited money within water resources grants for doing this equity work. But because of these co-benefits that green infrastructure brings, partnering with community groups, partnering with education groups outside of the traditional water resources scope allows you to sort of come at it from two directions. Often, a water resource grant may have additional funding or additional points for getting that grant if you have a social justice component. And oftentimes these groups may have their own grants that they would get additional points or additional credit for if they're addressing a climate issue for. And so going outside of the water resources community is a really effective way to bring in additional funding through partnerships. And maybe I can let Jordi talk about some of the community partnerships that were really effective too.
Yeah, I think like it's really easy to just be like, we do equity work now, and then put that on your website, and then go to a foundation who is funding equity, because I think equity right now is like super hot, like it's very, very popular. But I think aligning some of those partnerships with the work that you are trying to do internally is really important. I think that's the first thing that I would say. I think partnerships can be thrown around sometimes really easily, but like, what does a meaningful partnership mean, and like what does it actually look like, is a very important question to ask. We have partnered, like if you want more Black, Indigenous, people of color to partner with in different ways and within green infrastructure work, for instance, I think you need to go to them. I think a lot of the time there's this tendency to be like, well, why aren't they involved in the work that we're doing? There's this visibility of green organizations or nonprofits to be like the center of it all. But I think sometimes kind of going in and being vulnerable in those spaces will bring in those partners. In terms of like, funding and looking for funding that are more aligned with the work that you're trying to establish. It's really about aligning with organizations and foundations and funding resources that, again, see the value of equity beyond the next 3 years while it's still hot. So I would say those are some of my guiding principles around it.
Thank you. And Carla, did you have anything to add to either of those questions or points?
I was just going to second Tony's suggestion of going outside of the kind of water resources community, and because what you're trying to do is kind of layer on, how to layer on assets here. So you could be looking at community development corporations, and to Jordi's point, you want to kind of align with those organizations that may have already have an interest in that work that you are doing. So if you have an educational component, you may want to look at organizations that are interested in education around environmental issues or sustainable issues, or EJ issues. So you just have to be creative, but I also think that part of identifying your potential partners, and this again is to Jordi's point, there's no list out there. You might be able to kind of understand who works in the community by going into the community and developing those relationships and nurturing those relationships, and then kind of asking the community who they also work with. It may be easy, it may be something as easy as partnering with, and this is going hyper local, you could be partnering with the church in that neighborhood, or a really ultra community based organization to help kind of deliver some of those project and programs to those communities. So I just wanted to kind of put a finer point on that.
Excellent, thank you. And just to emphasize, Grace Hirschberg put a link for where you can find the slides afterwards for the webinar for those of you that were asking. And Venetius asks, if you are a consultant on a single project, as opposed to working for a city or municipality or in a region, how can you help advocate for or implement these kinds of programs? What's the role of an individual in green infrastructure racial equity work? I'll just throw it to the group there.
Well, that's something, as a consultant, that's something that I think about every day. And it's a really hard question, because especially, as an engineer, you're tasked with, designing it, bringing it in cheaply and effectively and efficiently. And a lot of times, a lot of these, greater social justice, environmental justice questions are outside of your scope. But I think something that, I know this is vague, but goes back to something I talked about in my presentation, which is that co-benefit mindset, of always be asking what more you can be doing with this project, what other ways it can benefit. So thinking about not just how can this come in, what can we do at the bare minimum, but thinking about what more we can do with this. If this is something, if the stormwater management mandate is part of this project, how can we be designing this in a way that benefits the surrounding community, not just benefits, our direct client, and communicating a lot of those benefits to the client as well, talking about, some of the ecosystem services that it provides, some of the access to green space. You're brought into a project to be an expert, and so leveraging that expertise in a way to talk about why this is important. It's not a super concrete, thing that you can do, which is going to have a measurable, immediate impact, but it changes the conversation and impacts the way that people are thinking about it. And I think the importance of that is often understated.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'm going to move right on to Suzanne's question. How did you value ecosystem services? If they have value, could they also have value for charging or taxing entities that do not contribute to solutions?
I don't really have a great answer to that. Maybe Carla or you already do. But
Yeah,
it's a trap trying to value, put a dollar sign on ecosystem services. There's a lot of research out there. Her name actually slips my mind at the moment, but I mentioned her in the paper. She's a researcher with applied agricultural and applied economics at the University of Illinois, who is looking at the willingness to volunteer as a way to sort of measure the perceived community benefit that people are getting out of this. But I think that's a field that has a lot of research that needs to be done before we can really realistically charge people for some of these systems. A lot of what we're doing now is providing incentives for good behavior rather than charging poor behavior. So, yeah.
Okay, Carla, are you already anything else to add to that?
No, I don't really have a good answer for that one.
Okay, we did not. I don't think the team dove a lot into that particular topic, just a little bit maybe. And I'm going to move right on to Candace. What are strategies for engaging, educating about GI implementation on all levels? And she's looking for information on framing about GI careers for young people and those at the local leadership level.
Can you repeat that? It was strategies for education?
Yeah, for educating young people or framing opportunities maybe for young people and opportunities for those on the local leadership level in, like why should they be interested in GI careers?
I think there's some value in the way that I would describe these are like youth core programs, and kind of explaining and what these programs actually do is give that experience and insight to young people. Here in Cincinnati, we had a sort of program that did that, not necessarily for GI projects, but for working with our Parks and Recreation, but kind of exposing them to the benefits of doing that kind of work. And then if you kind of step outside of, that was really for high school students, if you step outside of the public educational system, Public Allies has a really good structured program of of kind of integrating young people who may have, for 1, 2, 3 years of college, and in some cases, individuals who may not have had that formal educational experience to get involved and get engaged with government departments. We in the city of Cincinnati, our Office of Environment and Sustainability works very closely with public allies. We take on 2, 3, maybe 4 public allies each year. So there's some value to those youth directed and targeted educational service programs. Maybe you already, if Metro Blooms works with some of the young people there in Minneapolis, you might want to speak to some of the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So we work with young people, and I think we call it like sort of like this emergent way of doing things, which is basically like asking what each community needs. So like we tailor it to each community. So if we work with North Minneapolis, for instance, like I said, is an environmental justice community. If I say like, yeah, go join Conservation Corps, which I was a part of, by the way, they don't pay a lot. Like it's not like it's a really awesome opportunity, but for a lot of people, they also trying to economically support themselves or their families. There's like the social inequities are very different. So I can't just tell them to join whatever. I have to provide like sort of this like other ways of like supporting themselves, but also I can also expect them to be interested in green infrastructure on the get-go. I have to talk about it in this general way of, especially if they're not interested in green infrastructure approaches or even climate work. So it's really about like retailoring it to each youth in each community, in each kind of having this autonomy of the youth. And if you have the flexibility to curate a position or a work that goes beyond work, but like kind of goes into this pathway process, like apprenticeship, and kind of works maybe as a liaison consultant, like those types of pathways have to exist for the youth to be, to be compensated in an equitable manner, but also hopefully be interested in green infrastructure in the future, and still be realistic about money and like where they are economically as a person. So I think all of those things are not usually considered when we talk about like, yeah, go join the Conservation Corps, go join the adult crew or whatever, because I think that takes out a whole group of people that that may not be accessible to that.
Thank you, Yordi, for that. That was a great circle around to that answer. And I know we have a few more questions left, but I'm afraid we are out of time here. And what I'm going to ask is for Sarah and Brian and Danielle, if you could just take down the contact information for Carla, Tony, and Yordi, that would be great, and follow up with them. We would appreciate it, and I know they would appreciate it too. So we thank you all for participating and staying a few extra minutes here. Thank you so much again to our presenters for great information, the great work that you've been doing, not only over the past year, but over the past many years in doing this work and sharing just a small slice of what you've been doing with us. So we also wanted to let you know about our upcoming webinars, the North Central Climate Collaborative, August 24th on weather-ready farms, and the Soil Health Nexus on crop rotations effects on soil health, all things water right here. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Rebecca.